Hello there. Well, I'm, as Nigel said, Oliver Salway, and I'm one of the founders of Softroom, an architecture and design studio based in London. We recently completed a kilometre-long, flowing, ribbon-like wall that unites a suite of lounges for Turkish Airlines at the new Istanbul airport. And it provides a visual signature that weaves through the 6 new lounges, creating a series of unified areas. I should explain that at Softroom, we're well known for lounges. We created the iconic clubhouse for Virgin Atlantic back in 2006 at Heathrow, and with its pool table, jacuzzi, and 14-metre cocktail bar, it was quite a game changer. And it continues to win awards for Best Lounge even now, more than 10 years later. And one of the keys to its success is that it really embodies the spirit of the brand. And we've also created spaces for people like Eurostar. And what you'll see in a moment is the lounge that we did for them in Paris, which may or may not end up as the bar on the border with the EU if Brexit happens. Like all of our spaces, it's a true combination of function and style. We wanted to make people feel at home in what is Europe's busiest train station. So we infused it with the spirit of a grand Parisian apartment. The flow wall, though, for Turkish Airlines and the 19,000 square meters of lounges that it knits together are the result of an international competition won by Softroom. Turkish Airlines wanted us to deliver an iconic design for their lounges that symbolizes their new brand philosophy of flow. And over the past few years, ideas of flow and fluidity keep reappearing in briefs and brand value statements that we get from our clients. In the context of interiors, I would say that flow seems to be synonymous with seamlessness. So it's a call for an effortless quality to the user's experience, which should be fully thought up and joined up. And it's really an appeal for us as designers to carefully storyboard and script every step of the journey, not just for the guests, but also taking into account the operational and service needs too. So placed high up on the central axis of the building and resonating with the domed forms of the main terminal roof, the flow walls are immediately identifiable from the entrance to the building. It's like a giant billboard highlighting the prime location of Turkish Airlines lounges as the centerpiece of the new terminal. And the wall shifts and changes in form as it moves through the lounges to accentuate various different functions. At the entrance to the lounges, the iconic Turkish Airlines logo punctuates the wall, which then leads passengers up into this calm courtyard-like refuge at the center of a very busy airport. And the wall flows up through the reception area and then into the main space, which becomes a hub for access to the many different zones. The wall also has a nice natural quality to it that's been imbued into its timber surface, which provides a warmth and a character to the spaces that it encloses. To achieve that, the complex forms were realized first as a plywood structure and skinned in strips of bleached oak. And the surface is divided by 7 flowing lines, which are supposed to represent the 7 continents that Turkish Airlines connect. The light sequences are also used as intuitive wayfinding. Flow lines in the wall itself are animated by 6 kilometers of programmable LED lighting that can pulse or glow when needed. The final interiors of the lounges were completed and furnished by Doe & Co., who then invited local designers to create installations in the main courtyard, accentuating Turkish food heritage, plus a tea room and a library. We also created the domestic lounges, which have the same motifs of flow and the courtyard, and located in one of the piers that extend out from the main terminal building. The domestic lounges are kind of like a mini terminal in their own right, with their own check-in, security, and their own departure gates. In terms of the inspiration for the project, we had the great privilege back in 2006 of designing the Jamil Gallery of Islamic Art at the V&A Museum in London. And for that, we needed to develop a deep understanding of Islamic decorative arts, including those of Ottoman Turkey. So we spent time researching in Istanbul, as well as Damascus, Cairo, and Iran. So we had some appreciation of the history and of how to avoid the traps of pastiche in this sort of work. And apart from kind of drawing on cultural heritage, one of the other things that we felt was very strongly important to this project is that we needed to differentiate what we'd done from the very well-regarded lounge that had been designed by Autobahn at the old Istanbul airport, where they took a really simple, flexible, white domed motif and really ran with it. So for us, the next logical step on from Autobahn's rational domes was parametricism. And you immediately think of places like the Heydar Aliyev Center in Baku by Zaha Hadid, which has this calligraphic quality, but is obviously unashamedly contemporary in its approach. We also needed to respond to Turkish Airlines' new brand identity of flow, which is all about embodying a customer experience that's effortless, seamless, and uplifting, and their wild goose symbol is held in place by those 7 flowing lines of the Turkish Airlines continents that they connect. But as well as designing an object at the scale of a kilometre, you find yourself simultaneously needing to create something that'll work at 300 pixels across. And we'd noticed how Autobahn's domes could be adopted as the icon of the venue into its wordmark. And you see the same sort of thing at places like Ron Arrad's Design Museum in Holon. And also, sometimes it can have unintended consequences, like this is the Louis Vuitton Foundation, which I think looks rather like Austin Powers' teeth. So I think R1 ends up looking a little bit like a pair of sea lions' whiskers on its logo, but it seems to work. And then, of course, there's the inevitable desire for Instagrammability, and the trick there is to embed your hallmark visual identity into the frame of someone's selfies, kind of like an architectural photo bomb, which gives users the bragging rights over the space and, of course, provides priceless marketing for the clients. From our research time in Istanbul with the V&A, we'd been struck by ribbon eaves as a motif of Ottoman architecture, such as here at the Ottoman Sultan's Topkapi Palace. And we also wanted to create something that would be visible from the lower ground level of the passenger concourse, because many more people will pass by these lounges than will ever actually visit them. And so we had in mind that the ribbon was potentially a surface for projection and display, and we were looking with Panasonic at quite how to achieve that. In parallel, we'd been thinking about courtyard spaces and how they always feature conjoined facades. And so the two ideas kind of merged with a certain inevitability, with the ribbon wrapping around the courtyard spaces. And we also had a desire to interlock with the rhythm of the work done on the roof by Grimshaw, who were concept architect for the terminal, together with the teams at Nordic and Haptic. And we'd been intrigued by this vision of the terminal presented in Grimshaw's concept visuals. What lay beyond that white Shangri-La-like whiteout right in the middle of the space? And so our response was this, a kilometre of calligraphic timber ribbon that flows through the centre of the terminal. But let's step back for a moment to the competition design. This video was part of our final pitch in the international competition. Firstly, we wanted to celebrate the significance of the site. As we know, Istanbul famously sits at the crossroads of the globe, where Asia and Europe meet across the Bosphorus. But we also wanted to celebrate its location at the heart of what is now the world's largest airport, and our own site straddles that east-west divide of the central axis, so there's a neat link to be made to Istanbul's geography. And we could demonstrate how our design would reflect the brand positioning of flow, the flows of people, data, and of course the flows of the spaces themselves. So putting that all together, that led to us proposing this flowing ribbon wall that has the visual signature and provides the glue which sticks the whole project together. And it was always a fairly strongly defined element, as you can see here, even at the competition stage, because we'd taken the idea to run with a simple idea early on in the process. It had presented itself as this obvious solution, so we resisted the temptation to overthink it. And in the crowning glory of the piece, we placed a bar at the highest point of the site, slap bang on the central axis. And what better reference than the bower at the end of the Topkapi Palace with its similarly strong, prominent position looking out over the city. But apart from making a big visual splash at ground level, the main purpose of the wall is to enclose spaces that provide hospitality. It's a wall that brings people together rather than divides people, hopefully. The serving of tea is a central feature, and there's a great selection of local mezze on offer. And there's also a special restaurant for the traditional Turkish pizza, pide. Behind the flow wall, there were then to be spaces that were more warm and intimate, and the wall deflects and changes in its character to accommodate certain features like the cinema. So we had the great good fortune to win the competition, but of course that came with its own particular challenges in its own right. For a start, we had to go to tender on the project with only about 6 weeks to develop our concept design. So we immediately set about refining it. And one of the reasons that our pitch had been successful was because we'd been very open-minded about quite how the wall should be constructed. And we had two main options in play. Our preferred option was timber, although alternatively we could have done it as a giant kind of surfboard like CAD-CAM manufactured thing. I was very happy that we went with the more natural material. What you're seeing here is some of the visuals, again, as I said, of the competition entry scheme with the various functions that we designed. I should point out that Turkish Airlines and their clients and backers went a slightly different route on some of the interior layouts after we were on the project. And so we'd set ourselves this huge challenge of building this beast in the time available. And what's partly swung for the timber solution is that we'd seen the work of a company called Mikordam, who'd previously been doing the timber interiors for Zaha's work in Baku. And ultimately, we felt it could only really be achieved in the time available by a Turkish contractor and a Turkish company, partly because it was such a matter of national pride that for people in the country to work on the project was a great symbol, very important symbol to them. And so the fact that we managed to find a contractor who was able to build this, and were really the only people in the world that could, the fact that they came from Turkey was such an incredibly added bonus that the whole thing seemed like it was predestined in a sense. And the Mikordam experience was quite extraordinary because it's really one of those situations where you find that you really are able to hand over quite a lot of responsibility to the contractor because they have such specialist skill and such specialist knowledge. And I think it's really an example of a great kind of interaction and definition of the boundary between the concept architect and the delivery team that you were able to take now with digital design really quite strongly formed ideas and transfer them directly into reality in that way. But this certainly wasn't my first experience of parametric wall design, if you like. Nearly 30 years ago, when I was a year-out student from university, I worked with Ron Arad and Alison Brooks on a project to create a winding wall that spiraled up through the atrium of the Tel Aviv Opera House. And although there had been a CAD model made in order to calculate the Boolean openings in the wall, all of the production drawing was done by hand with pen, ink, and flexi-curves. And the overall form was designed by a series of curved ribs set out at regular spacings. And because I was supposedly the person with the steadiest hand in the office, I had to draw every single rib at 1:5 scale on huge rolls of paper with a 0.10 rotring, so it could be traced by a laser and cut directly from steel. So in a sense, it was a very formative experience in every sense, but I knew that this was not going to be the way to go anymore. We now have fantastic tools at our disposal to create this sort of stuff. And we'd also been emboldened by recent success of remote working in Italy, where we created a parametric roof structure at the Oreo Center in Bergamo, which is just across from the airport that you fly into on Ryanair. And we made the digital models in our studio, and with actually very little interaction, hey presto, the completed spaces arrived on site and worked perfectly. So the process felt a bit more like sending a file to a giant 3D printing facility than issuing construction information to a contractor in the traditional sense. So for the Istanbul flow wall, we used the same script-driven CAD software again, and by some of the standards I've seen, it was a fairly simple script. but even so, it heavily optimized the workflow for the designers, enabling them to create forms without laboriously reworking them. On a geek level, the script refines the curved nerve geometry live, since it provides a real-time preview of the final form, and it just allows you to work on the top and bottom curves and fills in all the rest for you. Alongside this, we had Atelier 1 engineers in London have a look at the structural principles for the wall, and they helped us define a lightweight structure that was compatible with the loading limits set by the airport. And they were also working with us on the requirement for modular, safe, and off-site fabrication. So we continued to use that script to develop the design of the wall as it flows through the different spaces and has to respond to the constraints in structure and M&E, which were likely to change on a live site. I mean, I couldn't stress how strongly this project was in flow itself throughout the design process. But anyway, all of that work then got us down to a rationalized set of sections that defined the wall along its length. Just like at the Tel Aviv Opera with Ron Arad in a sense, but with much less ink and frustration and rubbing out on AO drawing boards. And we also used a virtual reality system in the studio so we could compare the different solutions we were trialing and the impact of them, and see how you could create distinctive spaces like the cinema and even an art gallery with it. We also developed the lighting. And despite our best efforts to minimize the expense, what the client really wanted was a fully lit, fully addressable lighting solution along the complete length of the wall. So with Cinema Studio, we looked at various different solutions depending on quite how the wall would be made and what shape it would be. We ended up settling on a flexible LED product, which had a great white color rendition, because our instruction to the client was, please don't make it change color, let's just keep it white. And in the end, because they wanted it to be fully addressable, it did end up as over 6 kilometers of LED flexible lighting. Cinemod also worked on the programming of the lighting, so the lights could do various animated patterns, turning red to celebrate the National Day and so on, but without becoming too Las Vegas or dominating. I think it could be set to do something, I thought it was going to be set to do something special when planes left and they called a flight, but given the volume of planned traffic at the airport, that would have been a complete nightmare. So we decided not to go down that route. And knowing that it was going to be a 24/7 facility, we looked at how the atmosphere could be made to change through the day, which sounds obvious, but it's amazing how few lounges and hospitality spaces actually do this. And we also wanted for the lighting of the open areas to interact with the lighting on the main terminal roof above. Back in VR, we tuned things like the sight lines in the cinema by tuning the pitch and height of the seating. As theatre designers know, this is a really amazing use case for the technology because you can sit in every seat and check the sight lines. But ultimately, despite the best laid plans, the client went for the simplicity of a flat floor. So we then worked to finalize the detailed design of the wall, looking at all of the typical conditions, how it would arch over entrances, how it would meet the floor, or how it might incorporate a balustrade, and so forth. In fact, the client specifically supported our desire that there should be a degree of sculpting to the profile. It shouldn't just be a flat billboard. And it's always nice when your client is prepared to fight the boardroom battles for you, particularly when there can be cultural and linguistic barriers at play on a project. In terms of getting design review and approval. For the final production engineering of the project, we, as I said, handed over lead responsibility to İKO Mikodam in Ankara. And so after they received the finalized Rhino model from us, İKO then took the decisions over how to cut the whole wall into manageable pieces. They had to take into consideration the individual weight of each piece of the wall and the logistical constraints of their truck sizes. Each piece then got worked on separately in 3D using parametric modeling to define its underlying wooden carcass. Technically, İKO used a combination of Rhinoceros and Grasshopper. They use AutoCAD and AlphaCam for CNC routing, and some software tools for Total Station, which is used for topographic measurements as the fabrication is underway. And it really required extensive craftsmanship, since even though there's a degree of mirroring to the design, all of the parts were different from each other and required individual solutions to resolve them. ICOR had previously developed a similar production method to the one used on the ribbon wall for the Haydar Aliyev project, and subsequently they obtained a patent for their technique. And thanks to their expertise with their own invention, ICOR were really able to anticipate many of the challenges they might face on our project. They then created a first mock-up incorporating the lighting, which was not a small undertaking, as you can see how complex the wiring looms get on a construction like this very quickly. Thankfully, the first mock-up was well received by the client, and so we got the green light to move on into full fabrication, which is lucky because we really at this point didn't have a plan B, and we were certainly far too far advanced along the timeline to switch to any other solution. So there were great sighs of relief all the way around. And this ended up actually not just being a mock-up, but it actually ended up being one of the first segments of the finished wall. ICOR call their production technique engineered craftsmanship. And it involves working with Rhino software to accurately construct a carcass from horizontal and vertical plywood members. These members were CNC formed, so they could then be assembled to form a shape, which is a precise offset backwards of the finished surface that we'd modeled. This surface was then covered with 2 layers of MDF strips and 1 layer of white oak strips with a correct width, which were then glued, nailed, worked, and adjusted until they precisely matched the desired geometry. And all the way through, it was checked with topographical measurements to check that it was going to all fit together. Around 280 craftspeople worked on the production in ICOR's 12,000 square meter factory in Ankara. And it took them 4 months to fabricate the flow wall, with 2 teams from ICOR working safely in a double shift in the workshops. And because each piece of the flow wall had different forms, all of the pieces had to be worked on separately, but they also had to keep the continuous flow surface when they were assembled together. And it was also important to try and maintain the visual integrity of the surface as a whole, as kinks and bumps in the whole assembly, if it was finished, would look pretty jarring. So ICOR then produced a detailed method statement for each section, not an easy target, as the terminal itself was still under construction. And they needed then 40 trucks to transport the individual pieces across Turkey to the terminal site. Depending a bit on the site conditions, assembly of the pieces themselves took 4 months with about another 60 craftspeople. After that, the finishing process was continued on site, and we ended up staining the timber in situ to ensure there were no seams in the color, so it flowed seamlessly across the surface. So after all of that, you have this kind of awesome site ready for the inauguration. And I sort of have to remind myself when I look at it that it's 4 square kilometers of 10mm strips of timber, all hand-laid in 16 weeks. And I do think that's kind of an incredible achievement, particularly in a live airport site, which is a very, very difficult operational experience, particularly as the opening date arrived very, very, very soon. So the lounges are now finally open to the public, have been since about February in this year. And you finally get a sense of how the whole project all comes together. These shots that we're seeing just before the thing was finished, where we're looking there at the cinema and the art gallery spaces of one of the lounges. And this then is that view of the whole thing inside. I think it's supposedly one of the largest buildings by interior volume anywhere in the world. And you certainly get a sense of the kind of megalomaniac scale of the project when you look at it in this sense. So I think from the pleasing thing for us from the project was the way that actually in a very complex delivery scenario, if you have one great contractor to work with, or subcontractor to work with rather, it really completely changes the experience because you have such trust in their ability, and they really bring something to the project that we could not have done without them and probably would not have been able to achieve on our own. So it really was a great collaboration in that sense between the designer and the maker, facilitated by 21st century digital tools. And you can see here how the animation of the lighting works and just brings the whole thing together. I mean, in conclusion, I would really like to pay tribute to the amazing international team who pulled this off. We, as Softroom, were required to subcontract the entire Turkish design team and set up our own company in Istanbul to be able to do that. It was a really wonderful experience to work with people who really were quite an incredible local team. But then we also had the backup of engineers back in London and also Arup, who were on hand as project managers throughout the project. So in conclusion, it was an incredible experience. We'd never done anything so big, we'd never done anything so fast, and we'd certainly not done anything which had such important national pride at stake. It's something that I would love to do again as another project, but this really was a baptism by fire. Thank you very much.
What an achievement.
What a
My
relief.
God. So it's been open, fully running since
February. I think that Turkish Airlines moved their operations there overnight in February, and then they've been slowly adding other airlines to it.
What's happened to the other airport then? Is it
Well,
still operative? Was it Ryanair flying into?
So the old airport was much loved because it's right in the heart of the town, but it's prime real estate. So originally it was thought it would just be converted to, housing development. It was then declared that it was going to become a park, big, huge park, which obviously somewhere like Istanbul really needs. Eventually what's happened is it's become the private airport for Turkish military and VIPs.
And the political
That's
upper
right.
class.
Yes, exactly. So they get the convenient airport close to town, and everybody else has to go about 20 kilometers out.
So your client was principally Turkish Airlines
Our client,
or the government?
Well, our client was Turkish Airlines, but Turkish Airlines is a state entity. So as British Airways was back in the day, it's an instrument of national pride. So although we were working to Turkish Airlines' direction, there was also input from
so at
the head of
meetings
state.
there would be a couple of politicians?
If there were, I probably wouldn't have recognised them. And certainly the project, we presented up to a certain level and they would have presented on to their superiors, but there was certainly an oversight of the project.
And did you feel that there was a basic respect for your role as designers and for the project that as you had developed it, or were there kind of schisms in the realization process, perhaps even ones that you didn't know about?
Yes,
too late?
Well, absolutely. There were. I mean, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because you get in, you do a massive international competition, you shortlist 10 of the world's top designers, you choose one, and you choose their design very specifically, and then you get into the process and all hell breaks loose. Whilst we had developed a design that we were very happy with and the board of Turkish Airlines were happy with, there was then external influence to kind of shift some of the balance of the project to make it more Turkish specifically.
Yes, the ribbon itself doesn't feel particularly Turkish.
Well,
although you stress that you jumped into Ottoman culture.
That's right.
Deeply enough to grasp its sensibility, and there is definitely a different spatial sensibility.
That's right. I mean, that was a learning from the V&A, because for the V&A, the brief we had was that we had to invoke the spirit of Islamic culture without pastiche. And what you tend to see is as soon as people want an Islamic theme, you get all of the sort of geometric
cheap
patterning.
Restaurant window.
Exactly. And so we were very concerned that to move away from that and to find some other link. So it's obviously a convenient.
But the ribbon was there in the original competition
Absolutely.
proposal.
Absolutely.
But it's a pretty well-tried motif, isn't it, the ribbon? I mean, you've actually explained it goes back in terms of sort of design concept way back to Ron Arad and maybe even before.
Absolutely.
And the idea of some kind of corralling of spaces, and then expressing it in a wall which changes its angle and lifts off the ground. Are you, do you see that very differently now to how you did, say, in your early project? Wasn't there one in the Albert Hall? bar
yes,
in the
there
Albert
was.
Hall
That's right.
that has a sort
It
of
did.
meandering,
It did.
suspended thing.
That's right. It did. Well, I think the when we were doing the competition and kind of thinking about ideas, we really didn't want it to be a white parametric thing. But then
What did you?
well,
so
I
you,
just
so
just,
you were
just
fighting in
we
that.
were kind of fighting it, and because it seemed so, in a sense, inevitable. But then at a certain point, it was just, well, this thing wants to be born, and we just didn't. We decided to resist it at that sense, and I think
And it was a good solution.
it was a good. It was the right solution. But I think the thing that the great thing about working with ICOR was that we were able to make it something that was a handcrafted piece, because there was a time when it was going to be CNC routed from foam and sprayed, and then you just get.
It would have looked so plastic.
It would look so plastic. You have a digital model, and then you realize it in plastic.
I mean, in actual fact, by doing this in Turkey, you were able to do something that you couldn't possibly do in Western Europe.
No, absolutely.
For reasons of cost.
Exactly.
I mean, you mentioned how many people? 60 people?
Well, it was over 200 people in the workshop and 60 people on site.
On site. So it's super
Super labor intensive.
people hours
Yes.
heavy.
Yes.
I noticed that maybe I didn't understand, but the 7 bands
Yes.
seemed in some cases to bulge
Yes.
and in other cases to be flat.
Yeah.
So in some places it looked like a ribbon,
That's right.
but in other places it's got a sort of turban-like
That's right.
kind of, as though it were fabric that was being
That-
wound on itself.
Yes, because one of the other influences was tents.
Was
These
what?
tents.
Tents.
These, the Sultan's tent was an amazing thing, and it was a billowing canvas object. So in the same way, I quite like the idea that this was like a nomadic encampment that you turned up to, and they just sort of put this up to signify that this was a significant venue. So there's
There was a sort of fabric-y,
yes, definitely.
because I remember taking a bunch of students to Istanbul and they all got obsessed with turbans.
Right.
So that didn't come into
I hadn't known turbans as a specifically Turkish reference, but
they
now you
put them on top of their
Yeah.
conical hats.
Yes.
Or domed hats.
Yeah. But yeah, no. But I mean, it was in our minds, the idea that you're treating this material as a fabric and wrapping it around. Or it's a bit like when you see those sort of Chinese dancers with a stick and then a
ribbon.
long ribbon, and they do all of that, and then it leaves that shape momentarily in the
Yeah.
air. It's kind of freezing that and capturing it. I
But
think.
it isn't going to move, is it?
It's not going to move. Well, hopefully not. Yeah, we will see. Yes, hopefully not.
But the change of the lighting will maybe not make it move, but it certainly means that the ribbon becomes a device for ambience
Yes,
in itself.
it's a dynamic element, and I had not seen it completed until I flew into Istanbul airport for the first time. And you come down these incredibly long piers into the main terminal thing, and then suddenly you see the lights on the ribbon speed past and do something. And it's a great moment when you come into the
It's
city.
the light speeds past.
Yeah,
wasn't
they
it?
sort
It's
of-
a ricochet.
Well,
effect.
it's programmed in all sorts of ways, because it can do all sorts of things, but there's some where it sort of shoots lines.
What do you want it
pulses
to be?
round.
Don't you want it to be calmer than that?
Well, yes, I wanted it to be calm. The client wanted it to be exciting, so it's a sort of a balance between the two in the end.
And what about all the other clutter of the club lounges? I saw a little Turkish donut trolley or
Yes.
something in the...
Yeah.
It's hard to resist that stuff, but did you embrace all of that in
Well,
the end?
the way that we worked is that we had designed the layout in one specific way, and then the catering operator came in and decided to change all of it. So the way that they set out their hospitality elements in it was slightly different to how we would have done it. And they brought in all the little donut carts and all of that sort of stuff.
But with horror on
Well,
your
no,
part,
well,
or did you
the thing that-
embrace all of that?
Well, no, we sort of had to embrace it, but the other thing was that the previous lounge, the main thing that they offered there was this Turkish pizza, and it was so popular that there was always a huge queue. So we decided to take that element and make it one of the central focuses of our bit. So where the wall goes up,
So they can get their pizza quickly.
You can get your pizza quickly.
It's great lumps of meat and chewed up meat, isn't it? Very good. You occupy such an interesting position, shifting tactics slightly, in the architecture world. At what point did you realize that you were neither occupying the territory of the architect or the interior designer, but somewhere in between?
I suppose it was sort of slightly by accident, in the sense that when we started out, there was, and it's inherent in the name of the company, there was an idea of exploring both virtual space and real space at the same time. And so we started off doing a series of conceptual projects that were published in Wallpaper magazine in the late 90s.
I remember them. The penknife
That's
ad.
right. So they kind of established a sort of, I suppose, visionary aspect to our work rather than the sort of rather more mundane stuff we might be doing on the other side of it. Because of that, we came to the attention of people like Virgin Atlantic. And through that process, we really got involved in directing large-scale commercial designs for big organizations. And it calls on a set of skills which are slightly outside normal architectural practice, I think, because it forces you to engage with brand identities and demographics and all of that in a much more kind of...
And also the experience of the user in right up against...
Entirely. So I'd never come across this idea of customer journey before working on all that sort of stuff, but it now underpins pretty much everything we do.
But isn't there a kind of insidious sort of understanding of people as spending units and kind of people to be press those buttons with different faces on to say whether they're satisfied?
Yes.
That people are sort of turned into data?
Well, that is, well, you'd think so, but actually one of the things one of the things that came out of these projects is you ask someone like Virgin Atlantic or you ask someone like Turkish Airlines, do you have all the data on your passengers, like who comes into your lounges, what's their group size, are they male or female, where have they come from?
They don't have.
We don't know, which is extraordinary. You would think that this was all at their fingertips, but actually and the people who do know everything about it.
But it's essentially corporate.
It is,
it is. And how do you cope with the balance between artistry and corporate culture?
The thing about the corporate culture is that they are blind and they're in the forest looking for a vision to lead them out of it. So that's where we step in. So we are hopefully the shepherds of the corporate.
Oh, that's very modest.
Sheep. I hope so. Of course, in reality, the boot's on the other foot, and you can only shepherd them so far before the CEO steps in and decides to go in a different direction. No, I think the other thing is that we came to corporate, if you like, design through the route of Virgin. And Virgin positions itself as a rebel brand. So it's about being anti-corporate.
That's all a bit fake, though, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you can't deny the fact that they're a business, and they operate under commercial constraints. But having said that, knowing the people in the company, at the top of the company, they do still have a spirit of defiance, even against their own masters, in a sense. So we've always interfaced into the corporate world in a slightly kind of roguish way. I think that's the way to be. You don't want to be... They've got 1 million people in suits. I'm sorry, I'm wearing one today, but they've got 1 million people in suits they can hire any day of the week. They want to find something else. And actually, it's not at design manager level that they're prepared to go and find exciting people. It's the CEOs. The Virgin Clubhouse was a great project for us because so many high net worth people go through there, and it just becomes this amazing space. And then they say to their teams, can you get me those people that did Virgin? I had a great experience there. And they are individuals that you can communicate with and interface with. I can talk, you can develop an idea with a CEO that you can't develop talking to their team in the same way. So you learn how to navigate that corporate ladder.
So are you going to stick to the corporate path, do you think? Or what happens if someone comes along and asks you to design some sustainable housing?
Well,
How do you
exactly,
cope
and
with
that is well, no, that's absolutely key at the moment. I think the game in the last couple of years has completely changed, and I don't think that the traditional designing for the traditional corporate model has much of a future.
And what do you see that evolving into then?
I see that that the consumer, if the consumer priority shifts to becoming about being ethical consumers, and that the experiences you offer them have to become experiences of value rather than disposable experiences, then there is a hope that, because the corporates just do what the customer wants, that if you can change the attitude of the end users and what they want, then that influences what they ask from the people that are supplying those services to them.
But in what way can you imagine that that kind of change might, say, affect a project like the one that you've just talked about?
Well, you wouldn't be trying to build the world's largest airport for a start. I mean, that
So it goes right back to a kind of planning level.
Well, it does, because, I mean, anything that we might do in an interior sense, you could do the most sustainable interior ever, but if it's in the wrong building, in the wrong place, it's sunk, you know. So you have to follow back up the tree to it's not to do with the interior architect, it's not to do with the architect, it's to do with the person who comes up with this vision in the first place or initiates the project, who actually is the key to whether the project is going to be sustainable, beneficial, or of value or not. I mean, Patrick Bellew from Atelier 10 Engineers once told me years ago that they designed the most sustainable building in the UK in terms of its construction, life cycle, and energy use and disposal. And the projected amount of energy it would save over its lifetime was less than the fuel used by a 747 taxiing from the terminal to the runway at Heathrow. And you just think,
incredible.
What are we doing, you know, in that sense?
But the buildings with there hasn't we haven't arrived at a point where sustainability and kind of enjoyment have necessarily come together.
They haven't.
The enjoyment part is often kind of edited out because it's thought to be wasteful.
That's right.
But of course, enjoyment in itself is not necessarily wasteful.
It's not. Well, so I think the challenge for us as a society moving forwards is, if you take if you say that humans are not the most or only important people on this planet, only important species on this planet, then what share of the total resources do we get? Probably not that much. And then how much of that can you actually say you can spend on frivolity, things that are nice, things that entertain us? Or is it life during wartime that we're entering, where you can't justify any frippery or anything over the
Well, there was entertainment
enclosure
of the troops. You know,
That's right. I mean, you see,
Marlene Dietrich kind
that's
of
right.
added something.
And I think that however tough and austere things end up having to get, you will not be able to crush the human desire and spirit to want to enjoy.
So maybe
life.
the enjoyment of nature is kind of fundamental, because that really can't be eradicated.
It can't. And I think we need to make a new contract with nature where we don't see ourselves as its overlords, but as kind of, you know, stewards.
Stewards,
Yes.
caretakers.
Exactly. So we go from being theoretical landowners to tenants with a repairing lease, where you've got to hand it back to the landlord at the end of the tenancy better than you found it, or at least as good. And that's quite a shift.
But there are ethical issues around who you work for.
Yes.
I mean, there are certain well-known other parametric
Yeah.
purveyor
That's
of
right.
architecture who would quite happily work with dictators who were shoveling money into their pockets and then turning some of those vast funds into Taj Mahal-like
That's right.
buildings.
That's
I
right.
mean, where's the cutoff?
I think the cutoff is actually quite low down. I think that people.
Meaning that
Well, I
you
think people.
accept most things, or
No.
or,
I think
or
that.
the
I think.
opposite?
I think that. I mean, I think that. It's kind of hard to necessarily be able to fully understand who your clients are sometimes, and you think you're working for one set of people, and that's all
And
fine.
it turns out there's someone else.
And it turns out there's someone else pulling the strings, or a higher powers involved. And we've always taken the view that, and this came out from visiting places like Iran. So you go to Iran with these particular set of expectations of what the place is like, and the first thing people do is come up to you and said, please don't believe we're like our leadership. They stole the country from us. They do not represent us, and that is not how we want to appear to the outside world.
Well, architects generally are quite happy to usually kind of whore it around the world.
Unfortunately, yes. But I think that is going to become less fashionable. I mean, it's, already getting on a plane to this conference is, why did we not come by train or paddle across the North Sea or something? So it becomes...
Why isn't it like a kind of news night studio with screens with different people on them?
That's right. But unfortunately...
could be here with us on the screen.
Well, they could or they couldn't, because unfortunately, I mean, I think we may end up having to go down that route, but if we do, we're going to have to seriously up the level of subtlety and nuance that you can communicate, because some Skype call that hardly ever works, that's not where...
so old-fashioned.
Well, it's also, it's not, if you're working on a big project, that's not where, the meeting is only where part of the action happens. The rest of the action happens over dinner.
In the workshop.
And in the bar and all of that. And so how do you replicate that in a virtual sense? I don't know, but I think that is a challenge.
Well, maybe we have to take a leaf out of Greta Thunberg's boat.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you very much,
Thank
Oliver.
you.
It's been a great talk and it's lovely expanding on what you spoke about. Thank you very much.
Thank you.